everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Shantae White, and I'm a Senior Research Associate with the IWPR Student Parent Success Initiative, which we call SPISI for short. You may hear that today. And I'll be facilitating and moderating today's webinar. And so hopefully you all have tuned in to join us for our webinar to support the launch of our brief called Supporting Student Parent Recovery. Today we'll be exploring lessons from Georgia, Texas, and Washington State. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Agenda-wise, we will have a short overview of our briefing paper, which our IWPR colleague Maureen will probably pop into the chat for you all. And then once we do a quick overview of the briefing paper, then we are going to have a really great conversation with some of the leading experts from the states that are represented in the brief, just to kind of bring the content to life and unpack some of the issues facing student parents, and also some of the potential kind of policy solutions that we feel like could help create systemic change and usher in change for student parents. Again, thank you for joining us for supporting student parent recovery through state policy, lessons from Georgia, Texas, and Washington State. Really quick background about IWPR. As most of you all on the call probably know, or on the webinar probably know, IWPR is a leading national think tank, and our goal is to help build evidence to shape policies that help grow women's power and influence, close equity gaps and inequality gaps, and improve the economic well-being of women and families. We work really hard to win economic equity for all women and eliminate barriers to their full participation in society. As a program area within the organization, the Student Parent Success Initiative works also to build evidence and produce research that helps guide policy and supports change, and ultimately increase equity in post-secondary outcomes for college students who are also parents. In advocating for this population, we work really hard to amplify the voices of student parents and others in the field, such as advocates, practitioners, people who work in the policy spaces, and who are working alongside of us to increase equity and outcomes for student parents in terms of college access and college success. So our webinar today does just that, to highlight the release, which we are very excited to finally get out, to highlight the release of our most recent briefing paper, Supporting Student Parent Recovery Through State Policy, Lessons from Georgia, Texas, and Washington State. We'll be in conversation with a great lineup of panelists who I will introduce shortly. Before that, I do want to highlight and thank the funders for this work. We were supported for the briefing paper and this webinar by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and also want to thank Imaginable Futures for their support and help to fund the actual research that undergirds this briefing paper. So many thanks to you both. And then also thanks to our IWPR colleagues that supported the development of this brief, and also those external to IWPR that had a hand in the interviews, the reviews, and all the things. Like, it really takes a village to get a paper out. So thank you all. And so I'll move into a quick overview highlight of what the briefing paper is actually about. All right, so the context of this brief that we're releasing, and again, Maureen will be popping the link to that in the chat. The context of the brief is student parent recovery in the context of COVID-19. And so I'm excited to share kind of a few highlights from the paper. The background is, of course, that as many of us know, higher education is essential to accessing in-demand jobs with family supporting wages, and also improving family financial well-being. And in the brief, we talk about how this was true, of course, prior to COVID, but it's especially true in the context of the COVID experience, and also as we traverse through what recovery looks like. And so that is the context that supports the brief. And to better understand the policy possibilities that support student parent recovery, we conducted a review of literature and policy. And we also talked to several state experts to learn more about the immediate, medium, and kind of long-term policies in 3 states. Some of them that were enacted during COVID and some of them that were enacted prior to COVID that we think could be helpful in terms of models or examples that promote student parent of policies that could help promote student parents' educational attainment and family economic well-being. And again, we look at examples from 3 states. We look at Texas, Georgia, and Washington State to just provide and highlight a few examples of possible actions to support student parents. The key takeaways from the brief include kind of 4 thematically developed considerations for state leaders and advocates to consider. And the first one is investing in stimulus funds to support student parent success through childcare training and cross-sector programming. Of course, we all know through the CARES Act and other subsequent acts, there were multiple rounds of stimulus funds that were sent to the states. And one of the things we do in the brief is kind of explore the possibility for states who still have stimulus funds to spend, how they can actually direct those funds to support student parent success. Our next consideration is engage in state level reform to improve childcare access for student parents by increasing childcare accessibility and education and training programs. One of our findings that we noticed early on was that, of course, recovery wasn't just about the traditional post-secondary pipeline. Recovery involves adult learners across the spectrum, from folks who possibly need to earn a GED or graduate from high school or get an equivalency to enter the post-secondary pipeline, all the way through the 2-year settings, 4-year settings, and then of course, what we consider workforce education and training programs came up to be a major way that states saw themselves investing in developing policy that was focused on recovery. And so we want to make sure that student parents are thought of in terms of development of those programs. Our next point or consideration that we offer in the brief is for states to employ state level action for student parents at the campus and systems level by approving the availability of tailored campus-based supports for student parents. And in the brief, we kind of talk about some of the existing 2-generation models, for example, and also very specific examples such as the student parent liaison example from Texas, where states can have a hand in actually helping to shape on-campus supports that are specifically and intentionally directed at facilitating student parent success. And then the 4th point, which of course comes up a lot in the student parent, I think, policy and advocacy conversation, is collect state higher education system data on student parents. Data collection has been a big effort among advocates and among legislators and policymakers. And we feel like at the state level, there's definitely examples of success there. And we want to highlight those and encourage more efforts in that area. And so generally we consider, I think, this brief to be a really foundational document that will hopefully have some utility in terms of extending and continuing the conversations that are needed around systemic change and shaping state level policy to meet the needs of student parents. Though the brief only highlights examples from 3 states, we think that it could still be useful in terms of having utility for other states to think through potential policies, models, and things like that, that they could implement in their state. And so I think ultimately, hopefully it's informative and also has utility kind of as a conversation starter. We wanted to start that conversation today by having a panel who we want to spend most of our time with today, again, unpacking some of the issues and themes that we identified in the brief, and people who are actually, on the ground in these states versus being in DC like us, doing fantastic work and have much expertise on their area, and talk about some of the themes that are reflective of student parent policies that could support recovery from COVID-19. So I will get started next by introducing our panelists. First, we have Dr. Cayanna Good, Assistant Commissioner for Adult Education for the Technical College System of Georgia. We also have Christina Long, who is the Southern Policy and Advocacy Manager for Young Invincibles, specifically in Texas. We have joining us today Jennifer Lee, who is a Senior Policy Analyst for Higher Education at the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. We also have Joel Ryan, who is the Executive Director of the Washington State Association of Head Start and ECEAP, which is early learning. They're in the early learning area. And then we also have Drayden Jackson, who is the Executive Director for the Foundation of Homelessness and Poverty Management and on the Board of Directors for District 3 in the Central Kitsap School District. And so please join me in welcoming our panelists, and we'll get started with a few questions. Stop sharing my screen. Hi, everyone. Again, so excited to hear from you all today and help us to unpack some of these really important issues that we highlight in this brief. And so we'll get started kind of with what's at the beginning of the brief and then a little bit of background. And so as many know, post-secondary participation was really heavily impacted by the pandemic. And specifically within the 2021 academic year, and enrollment at community colleges was down, and enrollment was down for student parents and single parents. And we also know that unemployment, issues like access to childcare, and things like that were really exacerbated by the pandemic. And so when thinking about policy efforts and practical initiatives that can support student parent recovery and boost post-secondary participation, in the brief we described how federal stimulus funds could be used and invested into some of the existing programs. We provide a few examples, again, of policies and practices that may have been developed in some states prior to COVID that we think could be shaped and helpful for student parents or that states can invest in, and a few new examples as well. So our first question, I'll open it up to the floor to our panelists to kind of unpack those things, is why do you all think it is important for states to consider student parents when deciding how to not just build state policy, but also specifically to where to invest any additional stimulus funds that they may have?
One of the things that I think, and I'll say the word hypocritical, is that we say education is so important, but then when opportunity comes for those that in most need of it, we make those barriers, 10 times harder to receive those qualifications. So, when I was student body president at Olympic College, I asked the school to look at when student parents leave us and a community college and go to a four-year school, how many of them are succeeding? And, they never thought about doing it, or even, because now you went from this small place to this huge college where nobody knows you. You don't have the support that you would have, in a community college where the teacher knows everything that's going on about you. And some of that data that came back was alarming to them, that majority of them stopped because, that institution and to be honest with you, most of the institutions are not parent friendly at all. And I think when we talk about using that money, that was always the question of, well, how do we make space and how much does that cost? So if and Joel knows this, one of the biggest fights that we had in our school was we were fighting teachers that had children for space, for students that needed space to put their children in childcare. So these are the policy things that I think that when we don't put or have our lens on with, hey, that group of parents or that group needs help, it's not in the conversation of higher education at any level. And I always use the simple example is that if my child is sick, that counts as an absence. So, that's the simplest that you can go. So even in that policy, I'm already put behind that if my teacher doesn't understand that my child is sick, it still counts towards me. So I think having legislators and senators and people in power to change policy and laws has to understand what the struggles are that student parents go through to accomplish what we say is education is good for you. But to accomplish that, we have to not just be at the table, but also those stories of why it's taking me so long to complete because I have these other issues. Yes, I find it dandy. I shouldn't have had a child. I get you. But at the same time, how do I achieve what everybody else is achieving equitably?
Thank you so much for that, Drayden. I failed to mention that Drayden is our resident student parent, person who has very direct experience matriculating through higher education settings as a father, as a parent. And so I appreciate you kind of kicking us off with that lens and that kind of framing for our conversation today. Did anyone else have anything to add, just generally when you're thinking about investing funds and what states can do with these funds to better support student parents and some of the kind of, I guess, state to federal policy context?
Well, just to jump in and build off of our conversation now, it is just so important that we're building policy with parenting students and that we're really talking to students about their experiences and really understanding what that's been like over the course of the pandemic. One, particular area that states can really look at right now is childcare. And as we're seeing federal stimulus money and increasing investment in childcare, really making sure that for students in higher education that are parenting, that they have access to those resources, and really thinking about how we can make sure that that those childcare initiatives are accessible on campuses. And then one thing in the federal discussion, and I recognize this is a separate policy initiative, but I do want to highlight the role of Build Back Better and how important that is for young people right now, and particularly for parenting students. One of the core things that Build Back Better does is it expands comprehensive health coverage. And right now in Texas, for example, 1/3 of young adults in Texas do not have access to a comprehensive healthcare plan. Build Back Better creates a fully subsidized coverage option for those who fall in that Medicaid coverage gap. It includes funding for outreach and education, continued expanded subsidies for marketplace enrollees, and really importantly, it includes 12 months of postpartum Medicaid expansion coverage for those mothers after giving birth. And that is absolutely critical to think about how we're supporting parenting students, not just on campus and in school, but in every aspect of life. And comprehensive health coverage is absolutely a necessity that we have to make sure that our young people are accessing health coverage.
Thank you so much for that, Christina. It's so important, and of course brings us to the kind of current federal policy context, and which of course is always a part of the conversation. What some of your comments also reminded me of was a lot of the conversation around recovery for student parents involves just meeting basic needs and increasing basic need security. And so one of the things that we talk about in the brief is like potential models that states can actually implement to help facilitate progress in those areas. And we're hoping to hear a little bit from Drayden in terms of Washington's approach to actually addressing basic needs and trying to alleviate poverty in a program that has a student parent kind of component, or they highlight student parents within it.
Yeah, I mean, we had the pleasure, of working with Governor Jay Inslee's poverty reduction work group. And it was the first work group that put people with lived experience at the head of it all. And what that was we sat down at the table and we drove the report, Governor Inslee's 10-year plan to reduce poverty in Washington State. And, all of us with lived experience was at that table. And at least 7 out of the group was student parents. And we didn't, and I'll say it this way, we didn't even know the word, to put two together didn't even exist in us. We just knew that this is what we had to do as parents and as a student. We never put the word together. But what we looked at was the barriers that stopped us. BFIT, and in our conversation out of this plan, DHSH made a lot of changes to allow for students, parents to enjoy going through college without having things cut off, being able to be on your work source program without having to take away those times to study and work at the same time. So these are some of the barriers that in our state we removed from the 10-year plan suggestion. And I think a lot of that had to do with, the child was never thought about. So I would get with a work program and to, let's say BFIT, for instance, the 20 hours that was required in that studying was never put there. Or, hey, where am I taking my child? There was no support for that in any of that. Now, in our state, we've moved that a little bit forward where that access is opened up all the way, where it's not a requirement anymore. So, those things are important in how we frame moving forward. Joel would tell you, I mean, I was a WASDA rep and what is it called? Parent ambassador. And DHSH got me into college, right? Once they put me into college, I'm excited. I was happy. And I was like, you know what? I'm gonna finish my degree. I'm gonna get this. Soon as I get on the campus and I sign up, I have no childcare. So, that was the barrier. It was like, all right, so what do I do? And then not only that, the program that I wanted to go for, the state did not accept as a program that they supported for me to get childcare. So it was those type of barriers that really discouraged me. And I mean, if it wasn't for, like WASDA and Joel and those things that, hey, this is what's real, out of that came the 12-month authorization, that, hey, no matter what, our child can stay in there for 12 months, no matter what's going on with the parent, if I lose schooling or anything like that. So in our state, we're being very much more creative in how do we make that space for student parents through the programs that most of them access, which is like TANF and SNAP.
Shante, can I just add something real quick to Drayton? Drayton and I have been working together for a while in Washington State on these issues, but one of the things I think, I know there's a lot of advocates from across the country that are state-based, and one thing that's come out of Drayton's work is connected to student parents, but it's sort of connected to the way we do policy making, right? And I think, some of the challenges with the student parent policies is that the lawmakers, for the most part, have not been student parents. They've gone to four-year universities. They tend to be upper middle class or even wealthy, or they're, a single person or a senior citizen that's in retirement as the lawmaker. And so they don't have that kind of experience of having of dealing with this issue. And so they tend to have a lot of bias, first of all, in this, both racial bias, economic biases. But one way that Drayton and his folks have been able to really change things through the governor's task force was not only changing policy, but now we're working on a bill actually named the Lived Experience Bill. And so there's a bill that is going to be sponsored in January. It has support both in our House and Senate in the state of Washington that will allow parents not only to get reimbursed for childcare or their expenses to attend meetings, but actually to get paid for their expertise. Because probably many of you that are on this webinar, you're getting paid for your time to be here, right? But that's not true for parents, right? They have to take off for work, or if they might miss hours, they're not getting compensated. And if we can bring more people with lived experience to the table, policies that'll benefit student parents will be improved. And so we're running a bill this legislative session just on this issue of lived experience. And I just think, it may be something that other states would be interested in, or, and if you're welcome to contact me about it if it's something you're curious about. But a lot of it was started because of Drayton chairing this anti-poverty task force and a number of parents that got involved, and how that, I think, opened the eyes of policymakers about what they didn't know and where the missing holes are. And one of those missing holes, of course, is student parents.
Thank you both for sharing that. We'll pivot a little bit, but kind of related to some of the themes that we've been talking about in terms of recovery, in addition to making sure that student parents are involved in the actual conversations, that they are centered in specific ways, that their voices are included in policy making and shaping around basic needs. there's also a need to apply that same lens, I think, to when we think about how students enter the educational pathways, which could be in traditional post-secondary ways, but also could be on the workforce education and training side. And we're excited today because we have someone who can kind of speak to, I think, a topic that we don't talk about quite as much in terms of entering pathways and where adult learners are who may, for example, be seeking a GED or an equivalency so that they could get to some of the college or some of the education or training programs. And so, Dr. Good, we wanted to hear from you in terms of recovering and rebuilding the economy and recovering from the pandemic, reskilling, upskilling, access to training, education, and jobs for adult learners has been really important in terms of a policy solution. And so what are some of the ways that you have seen in Georgia or that you think that states can center adults who actually have families and children when building some of these kind of programs that are essentially either at the beginning of the pathway to post-secondary education or on through?
Sure. So I'm going to risk sounding a bit like an echo chamber because my esteemed colleagues on the panel have already shared, I think, some of the most important nuggets. First, we have to really know our data. I think in ed policy circles, we tend to talk a lot in the aggregate. So when I talk about our adult education students in Georgia, I always lead with, we have over 1 million Georgians who lack a high school equivalency or a high school diploma. But you really have to disaggregate that because I think that's where you can truly find the inequity, right? So what does that look like in rural communities? What does that look like in urban communities? What does that look like along racial lines? What does that look like around, parents who identify as being single parents, or perhaps they are partnered parents, but they are living in poverty. So we've spent a significant amount of time really delving into that. And so I would encourage all states, if you're looking at your data, sort of data writ large, to make sure that you're also having an opportunity to really, really, really get down into the weeds there. I also honestly think we just need much more sophisticated models for collecting very intentional qualitative data. So I am a huge proponent of actually soliciting the lived experience of our student parents, but we need a way that we can share that broadly. Typically, it's sort of distilled into bullet points, and I think sometimes we lose some really important pieces. All of our adult education students, they manage incredibly complex schedules, and so it's. Sometimes we think, okay, it's access to childcare, but it actually might be access to childcare because I work second shift. And so my childcare needs are very, very different. And if there's a large plant that is the primary employer, if I'm going to school, I'm managing my child's schedule, I'm just parenting my child, I'm working, I'm navigating childcare, that's just incredibly complex. And we need a way that we can really, truly sort of grapple with that. And I think both Drayton and Joel said this, we have a tendency to think that the solution is based on the need that we perceive and not the real need of our student parents. My high school equivalency program has, tens of thousands of Georgians, but I also provide an English language proficiency classes. And that also has tens of thousands. Any given year, we have close to 50,000 adults who voluntarily are hungry for what that next step could look like. But we really weren't doing, the best job in sort of unpacking how many of them, once they exited our program, right, to Drayton's point, were actually matriculating to post-secondary training. Short story, less than 6% within 12 months. And so, that led us to broker very new partnerships. And so I'm delighted that we're right in the midst of a grant that we've received with Aspen and the Ascent Accelerating Policy that allowed us to partner with the Department of Early Care and Learning. And we are piloting additional strategies to really promote post-secondary completion for student parents. One of the ideas that we're grappling with right now is, what if when you were enrolling your child in a high quality childcare setting, they asked, do you need an English proficiency class? Did you know it's free and flexible? We can sign you up at the exact same time. We're having that exact same conversation with our adult education. Do you have, great childcare, when you need it? We can sign you up for that at the same time that we're signing you up for our classes. So, the overarching idea is there's no wrong door to support.
Thank you so much for that. So many, I think, kind of themes and nuggets. I'm just like, A, I want to learn more about that program. And B, I really, again, appreciate you allowing us to think even earlier in terms of what adult learners look like and some of the additional needs that we may have that policymakers and advocates need to think about. And you also kind of use childcare as an example, which perfectly kind of takes us into the next section of the brief and a few of our questions there. And so state reform to improve childcare access was one of the kind of larger thematic themes that came out of our work, and this highlighted in the brief. We all know that the pandemic kind of reduced availability of childcare pretty drastically, unfortunately. And it's been an issue and talked about kind of at the state level and also at the federal level as well. And so one of the things that we wanted to know, get my question. One second. One of the things that we wanted to know, for example, was in terms of state policymakers and enacting actual state legislation or policy that can help promote access to childcare. What are some of those things? And also, what implications did you imagine that these will have specifically for student parents at the context of COVID? And again, we're excited to have Joel on the call, who has kind of direct experience at the state level in advocating and pushing for and supporting state policy and actually having some wins in that area. And so I'll turn it over to Joel to talk a little bit about his work and also specifically the Fair Start for Kids Act that we highlight in the brief.
Well, thank you very much. So hi, everybody. So I'm Joel. I work for the Washington State Association of Head Start and ECAP. ECAP is our state-funded preschool program. I'm honored to be here. I'll give you a really brief picture because I want to make sure Jennifer gets a chance to share some of the stuff going on in Georgia. But I would say that I'll give you the evolution of student parents. One governor ago, and this will probably feel very familiar to you that have been advocates for this issue for a long time, which is to create better access to childcare for student parents. I had a meeting with the governor's office, and I remember this very clearly. And we were, like a lot of you are advocates or lobbyists, you get into these chit chat conversations. And she was telling me about how her daughter was going to Princeton. And so going on and on about Princeton, and that's terrific, going to Princeton, studying philosophy, liberal arts. And then immediately following that, I said, well, I have all these parents who are really interested in going to college too. And one of the barriers is childcare. Well, you can't have them go to college. They need to go to work. And I said, well, wait a minute. How come your kid can go to Princeton and this is not you're not signing her up for a vocational degree. This is you're doing a liberal arts. That's different. These people really should be going to work or at a minimum to some kind of vocational program. So anyway, so that started this long journey, and it's taken many years of student parents. I will say this: I had an awful lot of help from two groups of people, parents themselves, because this has been the number one, I would say, issue for the parents that we work with in the Head Start programs. And I didn't realize that until I heard from a parent that was going to Central Washington University, and she tried to sign up to complete her degree. She was only a few credits away. And in our case, our TANF or childcare office at that time said, I'm sorry, she can't do that. She can do a high school diploma. She can do this other training stuff. She's not allowed to finish her degree. And I remember being furious about that. And the parents were equally mad. So parents themselves identified this issue for me as an advocate and a policymaker. And then I had a great partner in the Institute for Women's Policy Research. I started getting some information from Lindsay and the team there. Lindsay actually traveled to Olympia to walk the halls with me at the state capitol and had an awful lot of frustrating conversations with the agency staff about numbers and who's impacted. And the long and the short of it is, after many years of advocating on this issue, we got bipartisan support for student parents. And ultimately, it came down to convincing a handful of Republicans, even in the state of Washington, a handful of Republicans that as long as parents went to school full time, they could support it. And the arguments we used, the winning arguments at the end of the day was about the time it took for parents to try to complete a degree. So a student parent trying to, even finish an AA degree was taking like 7 years. And that meant increased public benefit costs. It meant people being on childcare longer. It meant that they wouldn't end up getting a good paying job. It was taking them longer to get through the system around student parents. And ultimately, we first passed a bill that was specific to single parents. That had a lot more momentum. And as Lindsay knows, I know she's out there listening, all the frustrations we went through. First, it was single parents. Then it was only specific degrees that would be allowable. That would sort of quote pay better. So that was more attractive. And then finally, this last year, through a more comprehensive bill, now parents can go for an AA degree of their choice, and that fulfills the work activity, as well as their homework time and their transportation back and forth. So their childcare is fully covered. And now we're also pursuing, hopefully in the years, if the federal Build Back Better Act passes, we'll pursue a BA degree as well, in an attempt to go and to take that further. But I did want to compliment you guys at the Institute, because you put in a lot of time and effort to try to support our work through data and just strategy and just talking it through. So really appreciative of that.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for kind of sharing those examples. Again, that's kind of what's highlighted in the brief, along with some of the other things we've heard today, just around the larger theme of removing barriers, which usually requires like a long-term effort, systemic change, policy change, and things like that. And those are really good examples and models, and appreciate you sharing the behind the scenes and the effort from different fronts that it takes to eventually kind of pass that kind of legislation at the state level. So we'll transition a little bit for the sake of time, but I did want to see if Jennifer wanted to add to anything that Joel mentioned in terms of talking about childcare policies or legislation in Georgia.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump onto what some of Joel and Drayton said. I think one theme that really stuck out with me, which I've seen in Georgia also with my conversations with students, is it's really important not to limit the ambition that parenting students have for themselves. And policies often just put a cap on that natural ambition that many students have. So, what Joel referenced, I've definitely seen in Georgia. I spoke to a wonderful parenting student named Genesis in her 30s with a young child. And she started at our technical college system, had a great experience doing her coursework there, and decided that she really wanted to pursue a bachelor's degree and become a school psychologist. That was her passion. And so she transferred to one of our four-year universities, but when that happened, she lost her childcare subsidy because that wasn't allowed under our current rules. And she felt so defeated. She just felt like the policies were telling her that she had a limit to what she could do for herself and her family. And so I think it's really important that policies pay attention to that, just not limiting students' natural ambition for what they want to do for themselves. So second, something that I just wanted to jump on, and it was actually your first question talking about sort of making the case about why making policies and practices for parenting students is important. I think it's really important for lawmakers to understand that what's good for parenting students, any changes that you make to improve conditions for parenting students is often good for all students. Parenting students can seem like a niche community, if you're talking just about childcare or anything like that. But in reality, when you're looking at things like, scheduling, basic needs, all of these things, all of those practices that are going to make education easier and more accessible for parenting students is actually going to help all your students. There's such an analogy, I think, to folks who work in like the disability rights space, that there are so many practices that we can put in place to help people in the disability community who really just help everyone. So I think, if you're talking to lawmakers, that's also a good case to make, is that, parenting students might seem like a small group to you, but really some of these practices and reforms that we're going to put in place are going to really help all students. One policy change I wanted to highlight also in Georgia that I know you also touch on in the brief is related to the work reporting requirements, which Joel also mentioned in Washington. So one neat change that the state agency made a few years ago in Georgia was that all work hours related to academics would actually count double towards the work reporting requirement. So, for every hour in class, it would actually count as 2 hours towards the work reporting requirement. Of course, I don't love work reporting requirements in general. That's something that we were able to temporarily suspend during COVID, and I think helped out a lot of parenting students. But, if those work reporting requirements are in place, I think that's sort of an innovative practice to look at as well, which we've been able to implement in Georgia.
And I would just add to that, those work reporting requirements for schooling, it actually is inclusive of adult education programs as well, which is just tremendously exciting.
Can I just add two other things and Jennifer, that's terrific too, because I think it's the Start Early person from Georgia that also was helping me with Washington. I think she might have worked with you guys in Georgia around this policy. But, one thing I was thinking about too is for those, because I know there's a lot of higher ed people on this webinar. One thing I learned through this, obviously this is a state by state thing. I went first to the higher ed committee at our state around this childcare issue. And that was a sore loser because they didn't know anything about childcare. And so when I talked to lawmakers, I ran into all kinds of trouble. I mean, they get the higher ed part of it, but they don't think about, childcare or human services and that kind of, so it wasn't until I found a champion on the early learning committee that I was able to pull this off. Then of course that's trial and error. So hopefully I'm helping you guys skip some steps. And the other thing I would say too is don't assume this is a Democrat Republican thing either. Because again, I worked with a large number of Democrats who would say, oh, these people should, as I said earlier, they should be going and trying to get a job as quickly as they can. They should be self-sufficient and, well, what about them going to the University of Washington? No, they shouldn't be going to the University of Washington. That's not for them, that kind of stuff. And that was a lot of Democrats. And sometimes they would say that in open spaces, like something like we're at now, or they would say it quiet to me afterwards. So don't assume that, because a lot of the Democrats went to elite colleges and four-year universities, and they don't, they're sympathetic, but they definitely are bringing their own biases into this effort. So, the student parent policy is really something that should be, I think, pursued on a bipartisan basis, because there are values for both camps, I think, that you can bring in. A lot of Republicans like vocational education, and you can kind of push the work issue. This is, you want to save money on TANF and and Democrats, of course, care about the child care early learning piece of it. So if you can combine those things, you can win on this issue. But I just wanted to make sure you knew that I'm sure the rest of you would probably say the same thing in your state. But don't assume that it's this is a partisan issue, because I don't think it is.
Thank you, Joe, for raising that important point. We got a yes in the chat, so that means that was really important. The people are right there with you. But no, that really is an important point. And just kind of like hearing some of the themes, in addition to, of course, policy that focuses on removing barriers. One of the things that we did grapple with in the development of this briefing paper was, directing states and state leaders and policymakers to actually be really intentional about understanding student parents and focusing on student parents. And that even though I think the research and advocacy and policy space has kind of grown in the conversation and discourse around student parent success has grown, there's still a need to help people understand why they should specifically speak to student parents in their policy development efforts, and why they should think about students who have children, and why they should think about more family-friendly practices. And sometimes it takes, our wonderful advocates and different people to really make that case, because some people still are not thinking that way. And that's one of the things we want to do in our work moving forward, is help state leaders to really specifically and intentionally apply a student parent lens to policymaking. And so I'm going to jump to our last area of conversation and point that we highlight in the brief, which is state action for student parents in higher education systems, where we talk about the things that states can do to improve campus-based supports and resources, again, intentionally for student parents. And these are actually a few really good examples, I think, of when we say apply a student parent lens or be really directed and intentional about student parent success, and providing examples of that. These are some specific examples. And so we'll start with Christina. If you could share a little bit about the unique policy proposal and advocacy efforts that Young Invincibles has engaged in and you've engaged in to move along some of the legislation in Texas that was focused on the student-parent liaison model.
Absolutely. And I just want to say again, it's such an honor to be here today talking about the leadership of parenting students in policy advocacy and change. And also want to shout out, I know there's many who have joined us today for this conversation in Texas who have been a part of research advocacy and change in our state for parenting students. So welcome, and it's great to see you here. We're seeing incredible momentum right now for policy in Texas that supports parenting students. And really at the heart of all of this momentum, similar to the conversations that we're having today, it is the leadership and experiences of students who are parents that are driving this. The most recent proposal this last session was House Bill 3462 by Representative Morales-Shaw, and this would have done two things. The first thing it would have done is it would have ensured that every public campus in Texas has a liaison specific to parenting students, a contact, someone that a student can go to, that they know that that person is really prepared to for any resource needs, any campus needs, any community needs that could arise for a parenting student. And then the second piece of this policy proposal was really to build data infrastructure, and it would have there was a proposal for campuses to collect and report data about parenting students. And this was so important because that data can be used to build programming, to build community on campuses, to create next steps at the state level about parenting students, to better understand parenting students. Prior to this initiative being introduced in 2018, we spoke with parenting students in Texas and continued to speak with parenting students in Texas about their experiences. And so one of the core themes that has really come to the surface, both at the beginning of our work and something that we're seeing very much now as well, is that even when there are a lot of resources, it is so difficult to find them and to connect to them. There may be, a resource that is completely different than a current resource a student is using that would complement the resource that they have. Or there may be a separate resource that might be better for a particular student in their particular situation. But finding that information is so hard. And so that is something we're still seeing today. And then the second thing is just ensuring that campuses are truly uniquely set up to support parenting students, especially with peer support and community building. There are so many things that campuses can do to create community for parenting students. And these needs only grew, during the pandemic. So we continue to have these conversations with parents across the state, and we're continuing to hear that, navigating the new resource landscape, especially with new aid and new programs that are being introduced, it's so crucial to have someone on campus that can help that process. And what I really want to share about this initiative is that this, as I mentioned in the beginning, this is driven by the voices of parenting students. And one of the things that we did was we partnered with different institutions and organizations in the area, like United Way, to speak with parenting students and to collect stories from parenting students that we then were able to share directly to the legislature and to the higher education committee. And we found ourselves in a time during the pandemic when being in person, we needed to prioritize safety. But what we did was we were able to find digital tools and written stories and still make sure that the actual experiences of students are being shared with legislative offices and with legislators so that they could learn about what those experiences were like on campus. And that was absolutely monumental in this initiative. And this initiative did pass through the House, had a lot of support. And while it isn't a law yet, what we really are seeing right now is there is this shared energy to create policy change for parenting students. And so we are really thrilled about this movement that we have seen. We are going to continue working. We are in the midst of continuing our storytelling and connections with parenting students across the state. We will continue providing opportunities for parenting students to share their experiences at the legislature. And we're very hopeful for what can come next in our state.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing more about that example and the work that is going on in Texas that's ongoing, and the progress. Because although the recovery, I think, context is of course focused on meeting needs and a lot of the needs that were exacerbated during COVID. There also have been some wins over the last couple of years, and people have made progress across different fronts, especially when it comes to student parent policy and advocacy. So thank you for sharing that. And want to say real quick before I turn it over to Jennifer for one of our last comments, that one of the themes that I'm hearing arise is around kind of the nuance that qualitative kind of research or qualitative data collection can bring. We heard from Dr. Good earlier about that. We're hearing from Christina about collecting student parent stories. And so I just want to kind of highlight that and have folks kind of hold that, which you probably already are, but just a reminder of, in addition to the kind of quantitative data collection and the data needs around student parents, that storytelling and really helping people to understand the student parent experience from the qualitative perspective is really important. And so kind of along those same lines, in terms of thinking about ways that states can connect to campuses or work across systems, we wanted to hear a little bit from Jennifer about kind of Georgia's 2-gen strategies or other ways that you see in Georgia where states are able to implement specific student parent supports.
Sure, and I'm gonna shift from my policy hat a little bit here, even though I know we all love policy and want to talk about it. I've seen that there are a couple of funders and foundations on the call as well, and so I just want to highlight a couple of, I think, really interesting cross-sector supports that are in Georgia that where the philanthropic sector has really partnered well with our higher ed institutions and with the Department of Early Care and Learning. So I'll highlight 2 programs. First, one is called Boost, and it's run by Quality Care for Children. And all of these programs really are, they're filling in where the state policy is lacking, because we know that, the resources for childcare subsidies are just limited at the state level. And in an effort to, target the childcare subsidies to areas with greatest need, there just isn't nearly enough money currently to support all the students who need it. So what Boost would do is they would provide childcare and tuition assistance to students who are not receiving childcare subsidies at 3 universities in Georgia. And students cannot qualify for childcare subsidies for a number of reasons. As I mentioned earlier, there might be in a bachelor's degree program that makes them ineligible, or there are quite simply a lot of students who just don't make enough money to be able to pay for childcare, right? But they make too much money perhaps to qualify for the childcare subsidies, which we also see. So Boost kind of steps in when that eligibility for the state childcare subsidies runs out. The other program I want to highlight for funders on the call is a program in Georgia called Nana Grants, which is partnered extremely well. Dr. Good's nodding her head with the technical college system. And they operate in, I believe, 4 technical colleges right now here in the state of Georgia. And what Nana Grants does is they pay the family fees or the co-pays for single parents in our technical college program. So these are for parents who are receiving childcare subsidies, but even with a childcare subsidy, you still have to owe a certain amount of family fee or copay, which could become, burdensome for families as well. So Nana Grants actually partners with the state agencies, with the technical colleges to be able to cover those copays for those parenting students. So those are a couple of, I just think nice ways that funders and philanthropy have stepped in to partner with some of our institutions. The second thing that I'll last mention is, I think advocates have talked about like braiding funds forever. Talks about braiding funds, but it really is really important just because there are so many different funding sources that can be used to pay for all of the costs that it takes for parenting students to not only get through their higher education programs, but also take care of their kids. But the problem is that we can't put the burden on students to know what those are. Like, what students are not going to know to ask about WIOA, or maybe they're receiving TANF, or maybe they're receiving, in Georgia, we have Hope Career Grants, a higher ed scholarship grant, but they might not know about WIOA, or they might not know about CAPS, about childcare subsidies. And so, I think it's really incumbent upon institutions to be the point of contact and just the responsible party that takes on that sort of administrative burden to say, hey, here are all these different sources that we can sort of help package for you so that you have the resources that you need to be able to take care of your family and be able to go to school at the same time.
Thank you so much. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to say something briefly because I'm sharing one frustration and one incredible opportunity. My one frustration is the early learning community and the higher ed community has had a hard time coming together on student parent policies from my perspective. I mean, there's a lot of work that Aspen is doing, and I'm part of the Ascend network too. That sounds like some other folks here too. The student parent policy in our state, our association had to drive that with parents because the higher ed people, they're feeling the crunch financially on their end. And from, childcare, of course, with the pandemic, they're really feeling financial pressures, and their goal was, increasing subsidy rates. And same with community colleges are trying to, just survive. So the student parent policy never sort of rose to the top of the pile for either group. But here's my opportunity. The Build Back Better Act, as Christina and a few others have mentioned, has a ton of money available for childcare if it passes. It would be good for all of us, whether, we should stay together, as I guess what I'm saying, as a national network. And, I think this is a worthy opportunity to really make movement on student parents at individual states, and to put some pressure both at ACF at the federal level, but also at the state level. And so I encourage us to think about, beyond this webinar, is there a network? Are there philanthropy dollars that like to come in and, really move the needle for us across the country? Because I think there's a great opportunity, particularly if that bill passes. I just don't think the student parent policy as it stands now will be the top, top priority for early learning advocates, and same with higher ed. I think that we need some glue to try to push this to the top of the pile. And we just have a great opportunity. So anyway, I did want to just thank you for bringing us together today, but I hope there's more of this and more conversation.
So too, I had
Are we
that
short on
same thought.
time?
I was like, we need to have more of these conversations. Did you want to say something real quick, Drayden?
Yeah, real quick. I know we're short on time. You know, with being a school board director, one of the things that we found that I don't think gets discussed a lot is when student parents cannot find childcare, it's other children that are watching that. And we found that out during COVID. And you know, one of the things that we're doing in our school district, and Joel knows this, I've been such an advocate of this, is connecting the K-12 system to the early learning system. And you know, in Central Kitsap School District, we're doing that because we realize that if we don't take care of the two generational approach of this mother is working, but then also that teenager is the one that when the mother's not there or the father's not there, that is watching that child. So I think, you know, we have to look at that as well with school. A lot of our parents that went back to school that are doing that, it's the teenagers that are watching the children. You know, and I think that gets lost within that mix, but we're seeing it because we lost a lot of children because parents are like, I'm working a double job and right now I can't afford them to go to school. You know, so our thinking of the K-12 educational system is how do we support parents that are in school too, but then also support our children that are in our K-12 system.
Thank y'all so much. As we start to wrap up, we did have one audience question that I want to make sure that we address. The question is, are there student parents being engaged to share their stories directly to the legislature, or mostly is it organizations that are pushing for policy and advocacy efforts? And I feel like there are a number of people who can answer this question, but I feel like Christina, you kind of pointed to kind of storytelling earlier, if you had some thoughts, and also Drayden, in terms of advocacy and hearing directly from student parents. I know that you have experience there as well.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Student parents are being engaged to share their stories directly to the legislature. And the proposal around campus liaisons actually first was initially proposed 2 sessions ago. And at that time, there were parents who came to the legislature and testified in support of this bill, and it was absolutely incredible. In navigating the pandemic, we did adapt in Texas with Young Invincibles. We did adapt, you know, to make sure that we were able to provide those storytelling opportunities while also making sure that everybody was safe. But, you know, going forward, as safety allows, whenever there is opportunity for parents to share directly with the legislature, that's definitely incredible. And there are many leaders across our state, many parenting student leaders that really seek to go to the Capitol and talk directly with legislators.
Yeah, I'll echo too, because I was part of a SENS student parent advisory group. And, you know, once we got that data and all of that information, it was easy for me to bring that into our state and say, hey, look, this is what's really going on. And it opened up a lot of our agencies' eyes first. So I think we're this session and moving into, you know, the future, this conversation and their experience is going to be brought up more and more, because the agencies are, in our state, the agencies were progressive in saying, hey, we need to make this space. Now it's just time to really put that around and getting our higher ed groups to really understand you have that percentage of people on your campus and you're missing out on money too as well by not servicing that. And I think that in our state, that conversation is growing more and more because of a lot of reports that when I was with Ascend Parents, once I brought that into the picture, it was given like, we didn't know this. And I think that's what, you know, a lot more needs to happen of having that lived experience voice, but then also like Christina's saying, giving that data, like it's out there and this is who's doing it and showing that.
Well, thank you all so much. We are a little bit over time and we want to be mindful of folks' time, of course. Thank you to each and every one of our panelists who joined us for today and are typing things in the chat and sharing your expertise and your experiences in your state. Again, to lift up and to highlight some of the things that we highlighted in the brief and some things that we haven't touched on yet. As again, we hope that, you know, our work could help push forward the conversation and continue the conversations that are happening around state level policy to help student parents recover from COVID. I also want to thank our audience members and anyone who joined the webinar today, and also thank everyone, of course, at IWPR and our colleagues who are on the call and supporting our webinar. And so thank you to everyone. And we do hope to continue these conversations. So be on the lookout for more, I think, work from IWPR and possibly events in the future that are focused kind of specifically on this conversation of what states can do to actually create systemic change that helps student parents succeed. And so we'll end with that. Thank you all so much and have a good rest of your day.